Hey, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining this series of cybersecurity webinar partnered with Cisco Systems. So far, we've covered current threat landscape with Cisco Telus, a threat research organization with Cisco Systems, Zero Trust framework for remote workforces, workplace, and workload. So for those of you who missed these sessions, we have provided the links in the WebEx chat window so you can review it. So since we've covered the importance of the Zero Trust framework and how it can strengthen our network security infrastructure, this particular session, we will cover the importance of processes and procedures. So today we have the manager of Cisco Talos Incident Response Team, Brett, and the chief of staff from Cisco Talos Incident Response Team, Marlis, from Cisco Systems, to discuss what the importance of these processes and procedures. So Brett, go ahead and please take it.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Jessica. Go. All right. So, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. It's great to be here to speak to everyone today and talk about why incident response is so important to your organization and what does incident response look like, going forward in a post-COVID-19 world. So, I guess just a quick introduction and background about myself. Like Paul said, I'm one of the leaders on the Cisco Talos incident response team. Been doing digital forensics and incident response for about 14 years. My background spans law enforcement, academia, then also consulting. I remember doing my first forensic exam, which involved basically taking a Polaroid picture of a cell phone, a car phone, one of those old bag phones. So I've kind of grown up in digital forensics and incident response and, everything from computer crime to really focusing on network intrusion and incident response for the last, 10 to 14 years. So what is the agenda for today's session? I want to talk about, Talos incident response. You may have heard about us in the news, you may not have. Talk about specific what we're seeing, what we're not seeing, right? Kind of weed out the FUD as it relates to COVID-19 specific activity. And then really these last two bullet points, right, which are really important, right? Risks that you should consider, right? Everything's kind of about measuring that assumed risk at the end of the day as it relates to cybersecurity. And then are you prepared for an incident, right, for that inevitable breach when it does occur? So the incident response process, right, everything kind of starts with preparation. And that's kind of what the objective today, right? You're attending this webinar to get more knowledge, obtain more knowledge as it relates to cybersecurity incident response, to really help you prepare for the inevitable, right? What does that look like? One of the most common threats that we see at Cisco Talos is ransomware. A majority of the incidents that we work today involves ransomware, right? Which is, if you think about it, right, an enterprise-wide ransomware event that is usually treated as an IT disaster. Couple that with a pandemic, with the ability to respond, it has definitely changed. So this is our version of the IR life cycle, the IR process. And this is kind of our North Star and what we follow from really all of the services that we deliver, everything from emergency incident response to helping organizations test and prepare, right, through doing IR assessments, tabletop exercises, which I will talk about later. But as I'm going through today's session, please think about the existing security instrumentation that you have in place, right, that you've invested a lot in. Think about your people, which are so important, right? That's really the magic of cybersecurity is, people applying processes to the security technologies that we've invested in, right, to help us contain an incident. So, all the way up to eradication and recovery and then post-incident activity, then it's like that racetrack. We're starting the process all over. One of the key things that I would like for you to leave with today is really think about, any incident that you've faced, that your organization's faced. That is the most precious intelligence that you have. Real incidents that are impacting or have impacted your organization. What did you learn from those? So that post-incident activity phase of incident response is really critical doing that lessons learned. That's one of the things that we advocate for on my team. One of the things I challenge our team to do on a regular basis is let's learn from all of our incidents, because, we are in the trenches every day seeing the threats, helping our customers, and we want to make sure that we are learning and applying the knowledge we learned from our incidents to help us for the next incident, right, that impacts a customer. So, like I said, we like to say and like to think that we do a good job here at Cisco Telus in keeping our customers out of the news, but realistically, that's not always the case, right? So it kind of goes with the territory of being a leading IR provider in the industry, right? Our name will be attributed at some point to being involved in an investigation. So these are just several of the incidents over the last few years that we've been involved with as well. So we were formally founded in 2015. I joined the team in 2016, so I've kind of grown up, here on the team until we fully integrated within Telus just about 7 months ago now. We have over 400 dedicated responders and intelligence researchers as well. And, outside of the NSA, we really are the largest, private sector security research and response team on the planet. And obviously global capabilities, right? We are a global Telus incident response team, and obviously backed by Cisco, that allows us to do and respond, right, on a global basis, especially during a pandemic, right? In a lot of ways, in some ways, I guess I should say, it's kind of been business as usual for us, because we are 100% remote and we are able to respond to our customers 100% remotely. We take pride on being vendor agnostic, right? So again, like I said, a while ago, we are backed by Cisco, right? So we will deploy tools such as AMP, Umbrella, StealthWatch Cloud, and then obviously Duo if it helps us solve a telemetry problem or a containment or visibility problem, right? So if you think back a few slides ago when I talked about the incident response process, containment. If a organization that's experiencing a breach or an incident, if they're not doing anything with NetFlow or that east and west traffic that would allow us to determine how an adversary is moving laterally within the environment, we're going to deploy a tool like, say, StealthWatch Cloud. And the same thing with like DNS, right? If you've heard of the cyber kill chain, command and control, DNS is super critical, right? DNS is the infrastructure that adversaries are using. So again, being Cisco, being able to leverage our security portfolios like Umbrella, that's going to definitely help us during an incident response process. One of the things that our customers really rave about is really that operational rigor that we have around process. And you're going to hear me talk about people, processing, technology, right? It kind of sounds cliche. I'm going to give you kind of examples and kind of show you exactly how that is applied to an IR standpoint. But the operational rigor is one of the things that our customers say about us. For every incident, we assign an incident commander. So an incident commander is our single source of truth for that incident response engagement. They are making sure that our team is on task to do what we're supposed to do, make sure anything that our clients are supposed to do, that everyone's that we're marching forward through that IR life cycle. And then really, what it all boils down to at the end of the day, the power of Cisco, being able to reach out across the enterprise to be able to respond to our customers. And last but not least, right, the ability to really partner with different trusted third parties, because on your worst career day, if you were to have say a ransomware event or a cybersecurity breach, maybe you're notified by the FBI of an incident, there's going to be several trusted third parties that you're going to work with. So we play very well in the sandbox with others, and it's important to work with all these trusted third parties during an incident response. So one of the great things about being Cisco Telus, like I said, 400 security researchers strong, is really our unique vantage point and view of the world, right? I like to say incident response and intel go together like peanut butter and jelly. You can't have one without the other, and everything starts with visibility. The level or the bar or the barrier of entry, I guess I should say, for adversaries is a lot lower than what it used to be, right? When you see a lot of the tools, everything's leveraging PowerShell these days, third-party pen test tools, right? Adversaries are leveraging these tools that that our red team, right, or that our pen tester uses to test our security instrumentation, our monitoring capabilities, our response capabilities. So really having that visibility across different architectures. It doesn't matter if it's endpoint, network, cloud, right? I mean, all those things are critical from a response standpoint. And how I like to say, you know, to really kind of sum it up, I guess really into a bullet point of, you know, our story is, imagine being notified by the FBI and provided a snort roll, maybe an IP address, infrastructure that an adversary was using. Us as a incident response organization, an intel organization, right, being Cisco Telus, being able to protect your identity, your privacy, you know, as a victim, right? But then also customers that have existing security, Cisco security technologies, being able to create a signature, right, or an indicator of compromise, or roll that intelligence into the portfolio, and then push that out across all architectures in 30 minutes. That's pretty powerful stuff. So, like I said, we work, you know, hand in hand with our intel folks, especially if it's a specific, a new threat that we're seeing within the wild that's impacting our customers. So let's talk about the breach landscape. I mentioned, you know, working with trusted third parties during a breach response. In the event that you are notified, or your organization is notified by, you know, the FBI, a third-party entity, maybe it's a partner or whatever it may be, right? You're notified by someone of an incident. You know, the breach landscape is changing. You know, it's not a technology problem. I like to say incident response really is that ultimate team sport. It takes everyone within the organization, different business units, you know, egos checked at the door, reaching out to different business units to be able to successfully respond to an incident. But then also those trusted third parties, such as cyber insurance providers, breach coaches, everyone has a critical role to play in breach response. And then, you know, change in adversaries, right? Adversaries are, you know, have really moved to the extortion scheme, and then copycats, right? So the minute one adversary, let's use Maze ransomware, for example, right? The adversary behind Maze. They were one of the first to move to extortion. We see some of these other adversaries kind of doing the same thing, copycats, such as Doppelpaymer and some of the other ones, where they are actually leaking exfiltrate data for organizations that do not pay the ransom. So the threat landscape is definitely changing and constantly evolving. So there are many different types of incidents that we investigate and that we work here at Cisco Telus, right? These are just a few of how our customers have raised the Telus IR signal to reach out to us in that time of need and help. And a lot of these names up here you may not be familiar with, but I see a lot of ransomware names. Sodu Kanivi, Ryuk, Sam Maze. Those are all ransomware. And then these are I talked about Doppelpaymer, Bitpaymer, business email compromises as well, right? When you talk about multi-factor authentication, right? That whole, you know, devices that we're adding onto the network from a zero trust standpoint. Adversaries need accounts. Those compromised accounts are their lifeblood to be able to carry out additional attacks, right? Whether it's to deploy malware, create additional accounts so they have a backdoor in the event that, you know, your security operations center, your security, network security folks detect that suspicious activity. They need those accounts. So public-facing services such as OWA, right, single-factor authentication, adversaries or go after that. So we have seen an increase in brute force attacks, which I'll talk about here shortly, right? The password spray attacks, where adversaries are basically taking word lists from previous breaches and then just trying those passwords, right? My favorite one, summer 2020, you know, exclamation point, right? You know, that used to meet it meets the password complexity requirements, but not really secure with today's threat landscape and how adversaries are doing those password spray attacks. So let's talk specifically as it relates to incident response and threats related to COVID-19. So we have seen an uptick in COVID-themed activity. No surprise, right? 2020, obviously an election year in the U.S., geopolitical events, right? I mean, spam, a majority of email today is spam, right? Adversaries are using that, right? The fear-mongering technique to get, anything that they can do to lure our end users to click on things, right? So I like to say, every good incident starts with an email phish or a pen test. And that we're definitely seeing it. We've definitely seen an uptick and observed that in the last 4 months, right? Adversaries obviously leveraging the COVID-themed activity and creating bogus websites, right? To lure folks to these different sites, to get folks to click on things, right? So there's definitely, new risks to consider. And, let's be honest, right, everyone, whether it's, coronavirus.gov, the fake John Hopkins infected map, right? Adversaries are going to those most popular domains and creating these bogus-looking websites again, so it looks legitimate and to carry out those additional attacks. So, phishing definitely has it, is definitely here to stay. And then the same thing, as it relates to these fraud and scam sites as well. One of the interesting things from an IR standpoint is, as it relates to non-COVID related activity, while we have seen an uptick in that, specifically, in our global telemetry, from an incident response standpoint, right, we really haven't, and this is one of the things that we reported in our quarterly 3 IR trends, which basically covered Q3 for Cisco, which just ended a couple months ago, is we did see while we did see an uptick in, say, spear phishing email attempts, we didn't have customers that are actually impacted where that led to an incident, say like a ransomware incident or something like that. And I will talk about here, if I have chance later, about how we've seen, in a post-COVID-19 world that impacted organizations' capability to respond. So business email compromises are, here to stay, still seeing a lot of ransomware. Then, like I mentioned earlier, ransomware really transitioning to that extortion attempt. So new risks to consider. I think, Wendy Mather, director of Duo, right, kind of said it best, really a new reality. And that's kind of, where we're at. Everyone learns as a kid that the stove is hot when we get our hand burned, right? So there's that new baseline, trying to figure out exactly what's normal, a new reality. I know from an IR standpoint, it's impacted our team and how we respond, right? As we're, asking customers during these scoping calls, working with them, hey, do you recognize this VPN provider? Oh yeah, that's a provider that we're using for this specific business unit that's 100% remote. So trying to find that new baseline, that new normal within the everyday workplace, right? It is definitely that new reality. So how do you prepare, right? I mentioned, I talked about this earlier from a people, process, and technology standpoint. Our people are the most important asset that we have as an organization. Knowing how we're only strong as our weakest link. Do our end users know that we've recently had an uptick in our organization for the COVID-19 related emails, right? Or how are we communicating that out, to our users? Are they familiar with processes, right? If they receive a spam email, are they forwarding that email to, say, maybe an inbox that your security folks, your security team is set up, so someone can look at that email? Do they know the process that is in place to escalate? And like I said, kind of in my introduction, the security instrumentation investment that our organizations are making, do we have someone that is monitoring those tools? I could tell you, give you an example after an example where, customers have had access to specific tools of technologies, but they didn't have anyone monitoring them. Monitoring our security technology that we've invested sometimes millions of dollars in is critical is very critical as it relates to reaching containment and then maybe preventing an adversary, a very determined adversary that is wanting to deploy ransomware within the environment. So we've been fortunate enough a few times. I can think of one customer recently in the manufacturing industry vertical that they were monitoring their security instrumentation. They did reach out to, Telus did reach out to us, and we engaged and likely prevented a ransomware attack, right? So, that was kind of a huge win for us. It was kind of reinvigorating for the team because here we are, instead of, kind of showing up on the backside of a ransomware incident, to actually have an active adversary in the environment. We saw them elevating privileges. We found out what accounts they were using. And, again, understanding their tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTP, that was really critical and actually a win for us. And, we were able to kind of help our customers. So that was pretty cool. As it relates to process, is it documented how to address the threats? I can tell you where we've worked with organizations that are doing that 24/7 monitoring. If we have someone brand new in the SOC, do they know what our playbook is to respond to an email phishing attempt, a generic malware type incident? What about ransomware? Tribal knowledge is great, but a documented, repeatable methodology, right, that becomes part of our process. So it doesn't matter if we have someone that's been within the organization for years or 6 weeks, right? Everyone has an understanding of that. And last but not least, technology, right? I mean, security technology is not a silver bullet. Incidents are going to happen, but it's how you're using those tools, how we're monitoring them, how we're tuning them to make sure that they're properly configured, they're receiving updates. That's very critical. What are we doing with the logs, right? I know sometimes, especially as it relates to SIMs, right, that the licensing issue can sometimes be a hurdle. So knowing exactly what logs we're ingesting, how long we are keeping them is going to be so critical. Nothing is worse than thinking you've eradicated an adversary from the environment, going through that restoration process of your backups, then to find out that you didn't fully eradicate the adversary and the accounts that they were leveraging to access, and then have a repeat ransomware event. So I've seen that happen a few times. So it's all about preparing. So let's talk about the different risks, right, out there. Yes, we have seen an uptick in adversaries doing a lot more scanning, whether it's 3389, right, RDP, looking for RDP, a lot more phishing attempts, which I talked about earlier, and then also password spray attacks or brute forcing passwords, right, from known breaches, known incidents of passwords they've collected. So, bottom line is it's important, right, knowing, the network edge, folks being remote, knowing exactly what we have from a control standpoint and what we're doing to monitor authentication and collecting logs is important. So if I have a VPN user here in the US, right, should I be seeing a 3 a.m. login from somewhere in Eastern Europe? Probably not. So are we monitoring for that, right? Do we have some type of alert that gets generated? If an alert's generated, who's taking action upon that alert? So those are all things that are very critical. And I've seen this happen a few times. One incident in particular, right? A lot of organizations can't afford remote access, software, right? So they're putting the cheapest and sometimes free things in place that sometimes have, vulnerabilities. They're not patched. Adversaries are going after them. So, bottom line is make sure that the solutions that your organization does have in place, have standard security capabilities, right? They're meeting that minimum standard. Another risk, right, something to think about and keep in mind is, a lot of organizations now are assuming that this is a temporary situation and cutting corners, right? And that's obviously not the case. I was reading recently a recent report that said 40% of CEOs, like for Fortune 500 companies, saying they expect only roughly maybe 40% of their workforce to go back into the office. So definitely something to be mindful of. Remote work, remote access, and teleworking is definitely here to stay. So, choosing a solution that we can scale and integrate within existing infrastructure, controls, and solutions that we have in place is very critical. That work-life balance. Had a recent banking Trojan incident, Quackbot, right? That the customer, they had EDR capabilities. They were monitoring on their endpoints. They had a 24/7 SOC. They had an internal IR team, and one of their risk model and their acceptable usage policy didn't accurately reflect a user opening up a browser, Google Chrome, Firefox, whatever, right? Opening up a browser and then logging into their personal email and then clicking on a DHL link that ended up being Quackbot. So, there's definitely a blurred line now between, personal life and work life. So think about those controls that we have in place from a data loss prevention standpoint, but also from privacy, right? So hopefully your organization's having conversations about that, revisiting acceptable use policies and finding what does that look like to make sure that we're not only protecting the enterprise, but also trying to balance that from a privacy standpoint as well. So some risk assumptions have to be re-examined. For example, a shared biometric fingerprint sensor isn't as safe as factor anymore as an individual phone or hardware token. And if you want more information about that, we actually have that out on our blog, talusintelligence.com. I think we blogged about that as well. So, biometrics are good, but something with, with the fingerprint sensor specifically and 3D printing, yes, there's a way to bypass that. So consider scalability for your remote users and how you will support solutions and controls. Think about your offboarding process, right, and your onboarding. How are you onboarding new employees now? What about folks that are moving on to they've taken new opportunities? How are you doing that offboarding process, right? And what does that look like? What do your workflows look like? You can't really assume that what applied, in late 2019 versus 2020 applies today. So develop and document process changes that allow for the appropriate level of validation and oversight. Again, that kind of being the theme here. Accounts are critical for adversaries to use, so monitoring the authentication of accounts is super critical, and then having a solution in place such as DOA, multi-factor solution, is very important, for your organization on your zero trust journey. And above all, orgs who are suddenly having digital transformation thrust upon them, ready or not, need help and understanding, not shaming, right? We're all approaching things differently. That, like I said a while ago, right, the work life, the personal life, that line is blurred a lot more. So think about where you're at, where your organization is on your journey, and how can you prepare yourself in this post-COVID-19 world. So, are you prepared? We've been talking about critical security controls for about 20 years, right? Asset inventory. I still see most organizations fail, at that, right? Do we know what's on our network? Do we know, what specific systems are on our network that are connected? So from an identity management standpoint, not just machine, but our users as well. So a lot of the critical controls that we've been talking about for 20 years, a lot of, the basics are still very important. As I think about recent intrusions, recent incidents that we've worked, one of the questions when we're kicking off a new incident with a customer is wanting to establish those objectives. If it's an organization that is heavily regulated, I can guarantee you one of the objectives is going to be root cause analysis, data exfiltration, right? Because we're heavily regulated. If we're in the financial sector, right, banking, if we're in Europe, GDPR, right, that hourglass. So, all those types of things, are critical. So, and really, like I said, it hasn't changed from a critical control standpoint. So think about, all these different things that you have in place right now that are protecting your business and your organization. What are we doing for remote access? How are we handling authentication, multi-factor authentication, identifying our users, right? Like I said earlier, that's one of the things that we've seen come up a lot recently is, adversaries love to compromise, virtual private servers in shared hosting environments. So they can use those to hop into organizations they've compromised, that maybe they've done like a password spray attack. So that identity management piece is so important. And then our endpoints, right? Endpoint controls, having, an endpoint, capability across all architectures, right? If your organizations is mostly Windows, having a tool for all your endpoints is important. So you have visibility into that, and then also understanding what the new normal looks like from a user activity standpoint. Data management, right? Like I said, users being remote, users being at home, what do they have access to on their machine? Does the DLP solution that we have in place take into account them being off the VPN, plugging in a USB drive, leaving with financial records before they go work for a competitor? Awareness training and processes. So that awareness training, educating our users, having a way to escalate things when they are seeing suspicious email. Awareness training is critical. And one of the things too, being Cisco Telus incident response is, one of the things, what we're doing, say post-incident when we're debriefing our customer is, especially if they have a SOC capability, is what are we communicating to what is the customer communicating to their frontline folks in the trenches, right? And people that are working in security operations centers, they want to learn. So that awareness training not only applies to our end users, but also our IR and our security folks that we have as well, and how we can learn from incidents. So malicious email attachments. Every good incident starts with a phishing email, right? So training and training our staff, right, and being able to, training the folks that are responding to, if you have a response capability, training your security folks, your network folks, right, folks that would be responding to a security incident. And validate that monitoring for these types of events is in place, and then the monitoring team is prepared to handle these types of events appropriately, right? If you have Office 365, whatever your mail solution is, there's different things, right? If you're seeing a DHL themed email, do you have a way, do you have a team, do you have a process in place where you could search out, if we know that this email here came in, it had a banking Trojan, right? It came in as malware, right? Which can be detrimental to the enterprise. Are we, do we have the ability in our security instrumentation, our tools to be able to search out for a specific themed email? So all those things are important. And then finding out, what did users click on, right? Web proxies, DNS, like I mentioned, DNS is very critical to be able to monitor that egress traffic, that outbound traffic, to see what malicious websites did they potentially visit, and then what's the scope? How many users did potentially receive this email, and then be able to proactively, before more users click on that suspicious attachment, being able to take some type of action within your mail solution to remove that email from folks' mailbox. So navigating bogus sites, and this is kind of the same thing that I mentioned earlier, right? The different, COVID-19 sites that are on the rise, right? Having a DNS solution in place, such as Umbrella, is absolutely, really critical, right? To being able to see exactly, what bogus websites maybe my users are visiting, what was the impact, testing that incident response plan and those specific processes. And then deploying intelligence-based DNS and web filtering. Like I said, secure internet gateway, web proxy, finding out what user the site, what user clicked on it, what site did they go to, what was the deposition of that website. All those things are super critical. So preparing to defend against ransomware. This is probably my favorite topic. Because, like I mentioned several times, Majority of the incidents that we see at Cisco Telus are ransomware. We're often brought in after the ransomware has detonated, right? The adversary's usually been in the environment for quite some time, and they've spent sometimes, days, weeks, not months, mapping out the environment. One of the things that we've seen how ransomware is evolved is, we've seen specifically in the last couple months, things not being days or months, but literally hours before. Once the adversary has that initial foothold, they've elevated privileges, they've mapped out the environment to when they are deploying that ransomware. So right now, think about the controls that you have in place, the process that you have, the people that you have, right, as it relates to defending yourself against ransomware. That initial attack, I've talked about that in link, at length here about, email inspection, how, adversaries are usually using a phishing email attack to come in. So what are we doing from a monitoring standpoint? And then user actions. I talked about DNS logs, web proxy, NetFlow. Do you have a solution in place for NetFlow? I've seen adversaries uninstall EDR tools because they've elevated privileges and removed that, right? It's not uncommon. I mean, everything's PowerShell and WMI these days. So adversaries, from a defense evasion standpoint, they are quite capable and can easily, bypass, the EDR solutions, right? Again, the security technologies that organizations have invested in. So it's really critical to have a monitoring capability such as, to be able to monitor NetFlow, to be able to see that east and west traffic, something that's agentless, right, that the adversaries aren't going to see. So, NetFlow and DNS are probably one of my two favorite evidence sources. Account compromise. You talked about, multi-factor authentication. Absolutely critical for all domain administrators, any public-facing service, and depending on where you're at on your transformation, with zero trust, right, multi-factor authentication is probably part of that strategy that is absolutely critical for all users in the organization. Had an incident last year where the organization had just recently rolled out MFA. It was there wasn't a lot of strategy and a plan, right? And really a process like, hey, if we run into issues, how do we do it? It became such of a headache for their IT help desk that an executive gave the direction to disable multi-factor authentication, and they were hit with ransomware, an enterprise-wide ransomware attack about a month later. So, those were some interesting conversations that followed. Well, what could have been done to prevent this attack? And as we're doing the forensics, doing the analysis going back, obviously multi-factor authentication was a very critical role that would have helped likely protect that initial account. So MFA is key. Privilege escalation. Free takeaway, Microsoft Labs to manage your local administrator passwords that you have in your environment, right? A lot of organizations will still leverage that local admin accounts, right? That's, local only, not doing anything to centrally manage those. So once an adversary has local admin on a single machine, it's very trivial for them to leverage, let's say, SMB version 1 to push out malware, leveraging a tool like, PSExec throughout the environment, and, kind of the rest is history. So Microsoft Labs is free by Microsoft. Definitely think about those local admins because privilege escalation is definitely something that an adversary is going to do. Even if your end user, your domain user, just has regular privileges, they need to escalate and elevate those privileges. So if they can get local admin on one box, one machine with your environment, connect to a file server, right, or to a map network share. GPOs, we've seen adversaries push out malware leveraging GPOs. The Ryuk adversary has done that, had a tactic change a couple months ago doing that. So all those things are really critical. And then when you think about, zero trust, multi-factor authentication, least privilege, network segmentation, having ACLs in place throughout the environment, those are all very important. Removing or restricting SMB. If you are in the manufacturing vertical and you have to have SMB version 1, tight controls around those, right, from a manufacturing standpoint. We still run into that today when we're supporting a customer that is in the manufacturing vertical, right? Antiquated version of Windows supporting manufacturing operations. So those are definitely important as well. And then monitoring PowerShell and WMI, PowerShell logging, definitely huge. Definitely find out, most of, I've talked about majority of the attacks that we see being ransomware, majority of malware and what adversaries are leveraging for compromise, for lateral movement is leveraging PowerShell and Windows management instrumentation. So definitely find a way to manage those. And then encryption of data, right? I mean, that's kind of the end game for the adversary. They're going to map out your environment, your your backup server, your proxy servers that you're using to manage your backups. They're going to usually compromise those accounts, the service accounts that are associated with those. They will take out your backups, right, and before they deploy the ransomware. So think about, so those secure backups. I can tell you from a recovery standpoint, good old tape backups. Had a customer recently that was really what kind of saved them at the end of the day. They still had some critical systems where they were doing tape backups, and that was their only way they could end up restoring, because the adversary, before they deployed ransomware, had destroyed their backups, and the tape backups, their offline backups that they had, saved them at the end of the day. So really think about, as it relates to a ransomware strategy, testing those backups. Think about the process that you have. And if you want to do a tabletop exercise with your organization, that's service that obviously we offer at Cisco Telus. But if you're going to do one kind of internally for yourself, I would definitely make it around ransomware, because, like I said, that's kind of top of mind for everyone. So how can Cisco Telus incident response help you and your organization where you're at on your threat management journey? Well, the Telus Incident Response Retainer is the vehicle, is the way that we kind of get involved. One of the great things about our retainer, depending on where you're at, right, we had a huge uptick the last 3 months. Obviously, a lot of organizations wanting to focus on IR plans and playbooks, readiness assessments, right, to that whole preparedness piece. But we have all these other services that are involved. We don't just, while we've seen an uptick, obviously, in emergency response, customers that have had a breach or needed assistance, right, we've definitely had that uptick as well. But from a proactive standpoint, there are a lot of other services that we offer, no matter where you're at. If your organization is a lot more mature, on your threat management journey, there are definitely services such as threat hunting, our intel on demand that we have, and cyber range training that we can do to help you where you're at on your journey. So 3 key planning elements right now. Readiness assessments. Again, this is a service that we offer, but right now, think about your organization's ability to detect, respond, and recover from a significant information security incident. How are you going to move folks around? Is your IT team 100% remote? Where's the data centers located at? What about your colos? What about branch locations? Think about that right now. Plans and playbook development. Have you updated your IR plans and playbooks, within the last 4 to 5 months, right? Because your IR capabilities have changed. They have changed. Your workforce has changed. Your IR capabilities have changed. And then tabletop exercises, right? Practicing, a tabletop exercise is a way to test your incident response plan. A majority of the tabletop exercises that we are delivering now are actually for that executive audience and other trusted third parties. It's not uncommon for us to be facilitating a tabletop exercise, have a big 4 in the room, right, with a trusted third party, your breach coach, your lawyers, sometimes even the cyber insurance providers. So obviously tabletop exercises are a boardroom conversation, a senior and executive leadership conversation. So it's kind of with everything, right? Test your IR plan, right, and your organization's ability to respond. A vendor agnostic approach. Again, being Cisco Telus, backed by Cisco, but we take pride on being vendor agnostic. We will work with the security instrumentation that our customers have in place. And I think that's what's critical. I know some of our competitors, well, only if you deploy our EDR tool will we get involved. We take pride on being vendor agnostic, right? So, supporting our customers with their security instrumentation. We are very focused on people and process, because that is exactly what incident response is, right? Like I said earlier, my favorite quote is, IR really is that ultimate team sport. The processes that we have in place as an organization, are really critical. So we take pride on being vendor agnostic and supporting you potentially on your worst day, but also hopefully during those calm seas through the incident response return, helping you build out those IR plans and playbooks, the readiness assessments, and doing those tabletop exercises as well. So from a resources standpoint, of course, the blog, right, in telusintelligence.com. For one of the great things about being Telus, right, like I said, we are publishing, we are sharing the trends and insights that we are seeing in the trenches every day through our quarterly IR reports. So we have information about our retainer, our white papers, like I said, those IR quarterly trends on telusintelligence.com/IR. And then, of course, our email contact, right, incidentrespons@cisco.com. Hopefully you've listened to the Beers with Telus podcast. If not, check that out in your app store on Spotify. And I was actually did a Beers with Telus episode back in May. So if you listen to it, you may have heard me on one of the recent Beers with Telus podcasts. And then, of course, the instructional videos as well that we have out there on the Telus YouTube channel. And with that, we've got about 12 minutes left, so I want to make sure I have time for any questions that come in. So, Paul, I believe I'm going to pass it back to you. And if are there any questions that have came in over the last 15 minutes?
Brett, yes, there are a couple questions that we would like to address. So I think the first question is do all of your services produce deliverables?
Yes, yes. All of our services do produce a deliverable, exception kind of being, so like our cyber range training and our Intel on Demand. Cyber range training, the deliverables, obviously the delivery of our cyber range course. So like, customers receive a student manual, right, and then everything like that. And then that Intel on Demand, that deliverable would be whatever the output of that specific ask is. Maybe it's hey, can you tell us what you're seeing on the Maze ransomware specifically? So yes, for majority of all our services, we do have a deliverable associated with that service.
Okay, great. So second question is also related to deliverables, which is from your playbook has a plan, what type of deliverables would the customer receive from a tabletop exercise?
Deliverable from a tabletop exercise? Sure. So the delivery of the tabletop itself, right, and then also an after-action report as well. We do an after-action report. So one of the things that we do, which has been kind of been interesting, up until, all of our services that we have, we can deliver all these 100% remote. Like I said, our team is 100% remote. Cyber range was the one capability that we didn't have up until about 3 or 4 weeks ago, so we've been able to deliver that. We've delivered tabletop exercises remotely as well. We just wrapped a tabletop I'm going to call it an executive tabletop exercise, but it was for the actual state government in the U.S., and it was across all different functional units, different state departments, and we actually coordinated that 100% remote. So yes, from a deliverable standpoint, aside from delivering the service, right, delivering the tabletop exercise, facilitating it, everything like that, we do an after-action report and do a full readout of what went well, what were the opportunities, and what's kind of the path forward.
Okay, so the next question is about how does cybersecurity insurance play into the IR services that you provide?
Sure. So, like I mentioned earlier, from a breach landscape standpoint, right? aside from us being a trusted IR provider, cyber insurance breach coaches and other trusted third parties are obviously important. Cyber insurance is definitely part of managing cyber risk. So here at Cisco Telus, we actually have relationships with various brokers and carriers right within the industry as well. So for customers that say, or maybe they're choosing a Telus, or they have chosen a Telus incident response retainer, if we don't have an existing relationship, just letting your broker or your insurer know that, hey, we've selected Cisco Telus incident response as our trusted IR provider, and that will get us kind of on the list with your cyber insurance provider. So yeah, cyber insurance is definitely critical. I could probably do an entire webinar on cyber insurance and that breach response, because there's just so much now, and a lot of it's changed just in the last 4 or 5 months. So it's a great question.
Okay, well, we'll hold you to that. We may bring you back for another webinar for that. Anyway, all right. So we have one last question, which is, have you had any incidents around remote workers that you can speak to as an example?
Yes, actually quite a few. One, I guess as an incident responder, it's like I always think of the bad first instead of those success stories. I know during my session I talked about a success story where we helped prevent a ransomware attack, but I'll speak kind of on the other end of the spectrum, right? An incident that obviously a very impacting incident. So yes, we had a customer in the retail sector. Thankfully, this was after, right, the holidays, right? So this was in end of February, 1st of March, which that's kind of when, right, the onset, at least here in the U.S., of COVID. So they did experience an enterprise-wide ransomware attack. Right before this incident, they had a few days before had just shifted their IT workforce 100% remote. So they were kind of going through that process as well. So we did see it significantly impact their ability to able to eradicate and recover from the incident. They had issues moving folks around, getting access to different office buildings to do re-imaging, get access to those gold images, because again, they hadn't fully migrated everyone, different services, 100% remote. So it was kind of the perfect storm for them as well. So yes, we've seen, obviously the pandemic impact organizations' ability significantly to respond. So think of everything right now. I guess that would be my message to everyone out there, is just think about your capabilities now. What does the new normal look like, and how would you respond to an IT disaster such as a ransomware incident?
Okay, great. I think those are the questions that I have. I will hand it back to Jessica. Well, before I hand it back to Jessica, so thank you everyone for joining, attending these webinars. Again, that we have a history of the webinars that we provided in the past 5 to 6 weeks. So if you guys are interested, please do reach out, and we'll provide the link, the recording for you guys as well. Thank you. Jessica?
That concludes our session for today. Thank you so much to the Cisco team for your time and a great presentation, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.